Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and we're delighted that you all were able to attend this session on the social contract. And so I guess the first question is, what do we mean by a social contract? And I think what we're talking about is the implicit contract between the institutions of society and the citizens or the participants in those institutions. And for purposes of discussion, we will focus on two such institutions. Of course, government. Governments have a lot of expectations, a lot of responsibilities as perceived by citizens, but what responsibilities do citizens have in this modern world of government? The other institution we'll focus on is the corporation. The whole view of society towards corporations is rapidly evolving, in many ways for the worse. And so the question is, what is that new social contract? What are the rights and responsibilities of a corporation? What are the boundaries of what the corporation should take responsibility for? And what about the employees? What are their responsibilities and the broader community? So this is a very rich subject. And we have the added nuance that, of course, the social contract as it's evolving is perhaps different in the advanced, mature parts of the world, like the United States and Europe, from the emerging economies like India and Brazil and many others. And we have a distinguished panel that gives us a chance to really explore many of these dimensions. I think we won't take the time to introduce everybody because you all know who they are. But we have government leaders covering both the advanced world and the emerging world, and of course corporate leaders covering both the advanced and the emerging world. I'd like to ask Stewart Wallis, our challenger, to really lead off the discussion, Stewart, and why do we need this session? What's happening, what's changing with this social contract stuff?
Thanks, Michael. Well, particularly in the advanced or industrialized countries of the world, I believe the social contract has broken down. If I worked hard and contributed to society, then I expected during my lifetime a fair return for those efforts in a relatively fair and open playing field. And if I got ill, somebody would look after me, and when I was old, somebody would look after me. What's changed? I think there's really been a seismic shift. I would highlight four things that have changed. First of all, risk. People perceive, and in a lot of cases it's real, much more risk. Risk to their money, risk to their pensions. That expression, safe as houses, asks people in negative equity. Well, that's a laughable expression now. Risks in terms of safety net in some countries, risk in terms of fuel and food prices, and that applies in emerging economies as well. And in many parts of the world, this is more an emerging country level, but not totally. Also, there seems to be greater risks because of climate change or natural phenomenon. So risk levels have gone up dramatically in many parts of the world, both advanced and emerging. Secondly, jobs. We've got double-digit unemployment in a number of industrialized countries. A lot of people worrying, is my job safe? In my own country, in the UK, the austerity measures are going to mean 100,000 job losses in the public sector, and those are likely in turn, because of lack of demand, to lead to 500,000 job losses in the private sector in parts of the country. Where are the new jobs going to come from? And if you're young, are you going to get a job at all? And that also applies in the emerging market context in a number of places. Just look what's been happening in North Africa, and that's part of the contract that's broken down there. The third thing is fairness. The International Herald Tribune a couple of days ago showed that over the 25 years from 1980 to 2005, 80% of the increase in American income had gone to the top 1%, note 1% of society. And that inequality growing in many societies, and particularly inequality between the very top and the middle and the lower, it's the middle also losing out, is a major factor that's causing problems. And also that sense that the people who caused it, in some cases fairly or unfairly, the bankers, and the politicians are the ones who are coming out of the recession with least scathed. So a real sense of unfairness. And what those all lead to, the fourth and last thing, is a loss of trust. Loss of trust in politicians, made worse by cases where politicians have seemed to be feathering their own nests, but also to some extent, and it varies by country, a loss of trust in business. And some cases, as Michael, I think, argues, the corporate social responsibility agenda can actually make things worse because people are proclaiming one thing and being seen, fairly or not, to be doing something else. So what that all adds up to is the landscape has changed. I would argue, particularly in the advanced or industrialized countries, that the social contract has broken down in a very, very serious way. Thank you.
Thank you, Stewart. So let's start with the advanced world, and let's start with government. And by the way, we've decided on this panel we're going to be informal. So despite the fact that we have a number of distinguished political leaders, we're going to use first names. So please don't anybody be shocked by that. So I'd like to ask Giulio to start us out. Talk about the advanced world and how the social contract with government is changing and what needs to be done about it.
We are young enough to see the G20 world, but we are old enough to remember the G7 world. The G7 world, G7 was a political body controlling 8% of the GDP world, unified by three fundamental codes. One code was linguistic, English. The other code was monetary, dollar. The third code was the Western democracy. G20 represent asymmetrically 80% of the GDP world, representing and not controlling, but it's not unified by the same old codes, not by the linguistic code, because a lot of people, they know English, but they don't speak English, not the monetary code, because we have not only the dollar, and not by the political code, because Western democracy is not the unique political form all around that table. Main difference. How to surf, politically speaking, on this kind of internet, how chat, which kind of system, which kind of software. I see, from my point of view, we have two main materials. One is theoretical, the other one is political. Theoretical, from my point of view, a fantastic map of the emerging new world is inside the encyclic Caritas in Veritate. You find in that text a fantastic map of the geopolitical structure of the world. The political basic could be the declaration on propriety, integrity, and transparency approved inside the OECD by 35 countries. It's the base of a long process. Inside the declaration you find 10 points. The target is a new regulation of the economic activity in the world. At the end of the history, our dream should be an international global treaty. But now, its text could be qualified as soft law, but after 2 years, it's an important goal. We must move. It's a long way. You find propriety, integrity, and transparency in the agenda of G20. We must work in Paris in the OECD. The plan could be a global forum on regulation. Anyway, that's the way. How to conclude? The old world was dominated by nation-state, and on the temple of nation-state you find 3 words: liberté, égalité, fraternité. Globalization starts with another temple, quite diverse, and on the front of the temple, the words were globalité, marché, monnaie. We must come back, obviously, on a global dimension. Thank you very much.
So I guess the government has gotten more complicated. There's a greater diversity of the influences of multiple government policy on what any given country can do. Abhisit, would you carry on? And of course, you're in an emerging country, but talk about the social contract that government has today, its responsibilities, what it needs to expect.
Well, we started off with the assumption that the social contract may have broken down in advanced countries. In emerging economies and in emerging countries, I think we're still in the process of drafting up that contract. And we want to do it in such a way where we aspire to have our people attain the same kind of standards as in advanced countries, but at the same time avoiding the pitfalls and the mistakes that had gone on before. Despite what we say about the need for new growth models and so on, I think the task and the objective of government remains the same. We want to have quality of life and happiness. And we do that by achieving prosperity and peace. The question is how we can best attain those goals and what kind of relationship the government should have with the private sector and with the rest of the citizens. And I think often the questions are badly put. You often hear arguments about big governments or small governments, market-led, state-led interventions, and so on. But the issue is more about the building of trust. It's not about whether the government is big or small, it's whether the government is good or bad. And a good government is one that wins the trust and creates the prosperity and peace for its people. And for me, in this age, the government's obligations, as far as the contract is concerned, should at least consist of these elements. First is that it must recognize that governments do not create wealth as well as the private sector. The private sector is there to create wealth and create growth. What governments do is to facilitate and to support. And therefore, the first obligation is that governments must create opportunities. That means human resource development, education, health, to make sure that our people are of high quality, and that they have the skills to have opportunities and jobs. Secondly, in a fast-changing world, it's not enough to have your people acquiring skills through schooling, through the education system. You have to give them the ability to adapt, to have the mobility, because we know that with a fast-changing world, there will be shifts in terms of production base, shifts in comparative advantages, so resources have to move around. And the most difficult thing is always for people to follow that shift. And therefore, it's always better for governments to create an environment whereby there is flexibility, mobility, and adaptability for its people to make sure that they can continue to enjoy opportunities and growth. The third element is that markets is good at creating wealth, but it's fairly poor at distribution. And therefore, the distribution job remains firmly within the government's obligation. And here, what we are looking for is the creation of social safety net, a good welfare system, so that the disadvantaged, the less fortunate, the handicapped, the unemployed, and the poor in general must have access to basic services to make sure that they retain their place in society, to make it a peaceful society, and therefore give them hope and the necessary support to benefit from whatever growth that happens. The next question we need to ask is how these things are done. And one of the lessons I think that we have learned is that first of all, any kind of intervention, any kind of policy should at least not go against the market. If you go against natural incentives, your policies are not going to work. So whenever you can, you should always identify market-friendly forms of intervention, provide incentives, provide the support, and not to over-regulate or control to make sure that you obtain your objective. At the same time, it's also clear that given the challenges that we have to achieve balanced growth, sustainable growth, that means environmentally friendly and inclusive growth, that some of these goals cannot be a kind of afterthought. I think gone are the days where you think you just go for maximum growth, create wealth, hope that there is trickle down, tax people so then you can have money to spread around for the less fortunate. I think those models are now out of date. What we want to see is a creation of environment and incentive system whereby the private sector actively takes into account these social dimensions of growth and actually incorporate it into their own objectives. So even for me, I think corporate social responsibility is not enough. Models like social enterprises, and actually for the corporate sector to look for opportunities that would answer social goals would be the way to go in this new contract. Finally, in all of this, you need to have engagement and participation. If any section of society feels left out of this process, the chances of failure, the chances of tension, conflicts, and therefore even violence or the breakdown of trust is always going to be there. Which is why it is always important to continue to strive for democracy, for participation, and to guarantee rights for people so that they can fully be part of this new social contract. These are my initial thoughts on the social contract for this century. Thank you.
So that's a very clear kind of set of components of what that government responsibility is. What are the responsibilities of citizens in all of this?
Well, clearly, if we want an inclusive and participatory process, we also have to make sure that they make contributions. For instance, just one example, we're now in Thailand trying to extend our social safety net. But we make it clear that they're not handouts. You need savings, you need contributions, and if they do their part, we'll match them in terms of contributions, for instance. This is done, obviously, in a formal social security system, but we're now extending it to the informal sector, where we ask farmers, where we ask street vendors, we ask motorcycle taxis, that it's time for them to save, and we'll match their savings so that they have some kind of social safety net for the future. But they have to play their part. And I think if we do that, they will rise to their obligations, and we have a better contract that binds people together for the common good.
So citizens have to be co-investing in their own
that's right.
Rights in the system. Michelle, would you carry on? What is this new social contract that governments have?
Well, first I have to say, Michael, that I believe it's very interesting that we're discussing this on the motherlands of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was the founder of the idea. And I believe that I will just want to add two other things that I think explain why we are talking about that. And there's two other changes. One is, I would say, the has been changing in the workplace, and social protection and social contracts have never taken into consideration a new one, because now we have jobs that are more flexible, that are more service oriented, that are more short term, that are more informal, and also that are increasingly held by women, and many of them who are, I would say, householders along with their kids. And social system and social policies had not necessarily given good responses to that. And the second issue that I think we need to take into consideration, and probably governments and corporates are not yet given the importance that it has, is population growth and aging population. And we have seen trends where the population growth will be bigger, and in 2050 probably we'll get to 10 billion people. And not only in developed countries, but mainly in developing countries, and with more chronic diseases, non-communicable diseases, so we'll get older, less healthier, and not necessarily richer. So we need to take into consideration how we deal with those things. But having said that, I believe that states, first of all, cannot be neutral. Because as has been said here by the Prime Minister, the market is not the role of the market to produce social justice and social protection. So we need very active, dynamic states, but also very efficient and that deliver. So we need to develop all the reforms to the state that will make states do deliver. And I will just add that I believe that democracy, when democracy delivers, really can be more sustainable democracy. So reforms and governance is really an essential part of this. The second thing that I want to say is that I agree with those who have said that the role of the state is, of course, to generate conditions, to create the conditions, to incentivize and promote better conditions, but also to be sure to protect those who have been more vulnerable. And in that sense, but on the other hand, promote competitiveness, big productivity, and all that's related to that, and that's been discussed in this day. More innovation, more quality of education, more skilled people, and so on. But also, it has to develop social protection systems. You can call it however you want. But of course, a country won't be able to develop sustainably if children don't have access to education, if people don't have access to health care, if we don't prevent the HIV/AIDS infection. So there has to be a strong social protection system that will have two I would say, dimensions. One is protecting, but the other, that is so important like that, is empowering people. Empowering and enabling people in order to get a job, a decent job that will permit them be an important part of the society. And in that sense, I think I should tell you that Latin America is a very good example, because many people have said, even with surprise, that Latin American has shown bigger resilience to the financial crisis. And if you look at that, I have at least two reasons that I can identify. One is that we learned the lessons on the crisis of the 80s, and we included the adjustment needed in the financial system, so not to have so huge risk. And the second, of course, we learned the lessons of macroeconomic balances and so on, but also we introduced social protection programs, others were more advanced in system. So after the financial economical crisis, we could avoid social collapse, and then we could, when the economy was recovering, recover much better. So I think it's also a very important issue. Finally, I have to say that we also have to define a new social contract looking at the future, not only at the present time. And in that sense, what do we need to do? We need to invest and make change in early childhood policies, because they're going to be the future citizens who are going to continue having a better education with innovation and capacity have economic growth. We need to level the playfield for the children in equal societies. But we also have to take into consideration the important role of women in this, in how we not only assume what the gender relation change in the world, but how we incorporate policies that could pro-women policies, if I may say, that will incorporate vigorously women to the labor force. But also at the same time, we develop policies to help reconcile work at the office with the responsibility at home. I mean, I think we have to share responsibility at home, but at least we have to find out how we reconcile these two issues. Especially, as I mentioned, there's a lot of single parents, householders. And finally, we have to also admit that we have an aging population, and we need to think also on pension systems that I believe it has to be with contribution also from the people. I think citizens, and probably if we go to talk about health, has to be also somebody responsible who takes responsibility for it. So I would believe we need a very strong state in the sense of active, dynamic, promoting and generating conditions, with a very strong partnership with the private sector and the civil society in terms of sharing benefits, but also sharing responsibilities.
Yeah. Gosh, that's a lot. We've got a lot of responsibilities in government.
Yes.
Just one follow-up, and then Stewart. So, what's the responsibility of the citizens?
Well,
sounds like government's going to do a lot.
No. I think you need to build agreements. For example, in order to get into a new social contract, you need to have, I would say, it has to be sustainable. So you need to have a social fiscal pact. That means that you had to, for example, what I did in Chile, we funded special funds for social benefits, sort of the model of the Norwegian, with the oil money.
Yep.
We did it with the copper because it was very high. Everybody was pushing me that I will spend all the money right now. But I thought, what if something happens? I did not know that the crisis will come. Otherwise, I would have won the Nobel Prize of economy. But what I did is said, let's save money for bad times, counter-cyclical measures. And in that sense, we could do it. But I could tell you, I explained to the people, probably my approval rates came very low down at that time. But then people understood. And when we needed the money, we saw we could do it. We not only knew what we have to do, but we had the money to do it. So then people said, oh, she was wise. But you need to build sort of partnership with the civil society. And they have to be responsible. For example, we won't solve the health problems in a society that is aging, in populations that are bigger, if you don't promote health, promotional, I would say, proactive health attitude. And the civil society has big responsibilities. In security, you need to, for example, against delinquency, you need to involve and to engage civil society in common plans. So they play their role, and the government and the police forces play their role. So in each area, I can think and imagine on civil society participation. I had great experience, for example, in housing and neighborhoods improvements, where we work with the civil society. They were the ones who identified. They learned to, negotiate between themselves. They develop, they empower themselves, and the government helps them, but they also are part, and they're afterwards responsible for that too.
So it sounds like citizens can co-invest. They have some skin in the game. You sound like a lot of this is talking to them and communicating and helping them understand the realities of the situation, and then this kind of joint public-private behavior.
And making participating in actions.
Stewart?
Well, my challenge is that I hear really good things. I agree with a lot of that, and there's a lot there, but I still think it's not enough. Lloyd George, our earlier UK Prime Minister, said, if you want to jump a chasm, you don't do so in 2 leaps. And this still feels like moving forward, whereas actually what we need is one big leap. Now, how the heck would we do that? Well, I would argue first that a new social contract needs a different economics. We can't anymore, we're talking about it here, but we can't anymore keep running the vehicle just looking at a means, looking at the speedo. We need other dials. So we need, especially in the advanced economies, to be focusing on and having measures on quality of life, on are we creating sufficient good jobs. So that's a clear government objective with the private sector. Are we protecting people from risk? Is it fair? And are we living within our ecological means? Those all need to be on the dashboard. We need the temperature gauge. We need the fuel gauge. We can't do it anymore.
So just economic growth rate, not a very good metric.
No, you can't, because growth rate in many countries is not translating into things that citizens want, and we've got to change it. And that requires, I absolutely agree, it's the argument about big and small state feels like absolutely the wrong one. What we need to be talking about is a strategic state, a smart state, and that strategic state sets the incentive structure and works in partnership with people. It does expect much more of citizens, so it's not just about being involved. They actually have to do a lot more. I think that's absolutely right. And similarly, there's a contract with the private sector. But it feels to me like we're not thinking wide enough yet. I think it feels like we're in a very different place, and even for the emerging economies, they don't want to be following the same path. They've got to have some different dials on the dashboard, and we've got to have a new strategic partnership that blurs these rather, for instance, profit versus non-profit. All those boundaries need blurring, shared value, and measures to do that. We're all in it together. There's the rhetoric, but we need to make that the reality.
Okay, well, let's move ahead. So let's talk about the corporation. It's already come up several times and of course this is something I believe deeply, that only the private sector can actually create wealth. Only the corporation can actually create wealth. Government can use that wealth better or worse. It can redistribute it, but ultimately the private sector has to work or nothing works. But the private sector is being asked to do new things, and the private sector is not being held in the esteem that it has historically in many countries, including the U.S. Ron, what is this new relationship that corporations have with the society and with their employees? How's that changing? What do we need to do?
Well, I would first probably argue that, at least in the U.S., that the social contract hasn't broken down. The social contract is adapting and changing to a new environment, a new set of circumstances that really represent historic, dramatic changes both economically, technologically, and in the rebalance between the West and the East. And in that context, I think the corporation's responsibilities really start out first and foremost in terms of operating as an organization with values that has integrity, that focuses on the engagement and well-being of its employees, and works to earn the trust of the critical constituencies that are essential for its well-being and survival and its participation in society. Secondly, the corporation has an obligation to innovate. It's a unique entity where every day reality is defined by its ability to win customers, meet customers' needs, and achieve a profit while doing so. And so I think one of the obligations, therefore, is really to innovate, reinvent itself, earn a profit, and create wealth in the society in which it participates. A derivative of that is really its obligation to create jobs. But the requirement that it confront reality means that there are times when it must expand, there are times when it must contract, there are times when it must shrink in one part of its geography while growing in another part. And so this whole notion of job creation has a long-term sustainable perspective, recognizing that there very well may be fluctuations. I think it's also important that the corporation operate in a sustainable way. And that really means both in the context of resources as well as risk, that it really have a long-term perspective and think about how does it really evolve and change. For example, in our organization, we reached the point today where 40% of our employees work virtually from their home. And we believe that that's a very important contribution to sustainability, but also to the huge percentage of our workforce who are single parents and women, because it really creates much more flexibility and is central to this whole notion of sustainability. I think fundamentally also that corporations have a responsibility for operating as meritocracies and providing a level of social mobility that's based on demonstrated competence and an ability to produce results. And what that means is it should be a place where those people who produce results, who demonstrate great leadership, are able to aspire to positions of leadership and positions of wealth based on their contribution to value creation. I would close by quoting a woman I once met who ran a very large and successful hospital that was led by a religious order that was a nonprofit charitable group. And I asked her, how did they reconcile the level of efficiency, the tough decisions they made, and the fairly substantial surplus they generated every year? And she reminded me very succinctly that if there was no profit margin, there would be no mission.
So Ron, you've talked a lot about how the corporation it needs to be adaptive and operate in a variety of ways that you described. Again, let me ask the same question I've asked to the government leaders. So what should employees be expected to do? What are their obligations?
I think that there is a mutual obligation that I've really heard responded to here, which is the employee has an obligation to bring the best of themselves into the workplace and also to assume responsibility for their part of their development and learning and training. And to recognize that the workforce will change. And for example, in our environment, there were many people who started out doing data entry key punch in the days of the large mainframe computers. Those jobs simply don't exist. But those people, many of whom were retrained to do other activities in the workplace. And so I believe one of the important things that the employee brings is a level of collaboration and a commitment to recognize that adaptability is going to be essential to the ongoing sustainability of the corporation, but it's also essential to the ongoing ability for them to be employed and to contribute to the well-being of the organization. I would probably close on one example that I think integrates all of this, which is the whole debate that many of us are having around health care and health services. What is the role of government? In some places, government has promised too much and can't deliver it. In other places, it has promised too little. In some places, individuals have assumed no responsibility for their own well-being. In others, they've assumed too much. And so I believe that this whole debate around the evolution of the social contract, and it's something we're going through in the U.S. as we look at how is it that we should deliver health care. And I think it brings us to the fact that solutions to these problems in most instances are going to require public-private partnerships, volunteerism, corporate philanthropy, and individuals taking responsibility in some ways for their own well-being. And I think the government can play a central role in helping us do that.
It's interesting that you can err on both sides. You can try to take too much responsibility, or you can take too little. And that really applies to both the institution as well as to the customers of that institution, the employees of that institution. And I think there's a theme building here. But Anand, could you continue? You're running major businesses in the emerging economies. What's the evolving social contract there?
Well, first of all, Mike, I'd like to share with this audience that about 30 years ago, I was at business school and I took a course by a certain Professor Michael Porter on competitive strategy and sweated a whole semester to get through it. I think I did decently, but every morning I'd get up and get ready to joust and do battle. And I woke up this morning with exactly the same feeling. And I feel like I'm coming out here to get a grade again. And on top of that, you gave us required reading, the whole panel. Yep. So just make an allowance when you grade me for that level of intimidation. But let me just take you in a sense, on a heritage tour, if you will, of the evolution of the social contract in India as it applied to government as well as today to corporations. Frankly, if you look at the framing of the concept of social contract, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, it really came about, Stewart, if I'm not wrong, defer to your knowledge of English history here, it came about as a contract between rulers and the ruled. And ironically, in India, until independence, that was the social contract. It was the contract between the ruler and the ruled. And essentially, the promise made by the ruler to the ruled was that, well, if you allow us to continue ruling you, we will prevent you people from getting at each other's throats, and you will be allowed to call yourselves a country. Which is a good deal, actually, when you look back at it. It wasn't as bad as it sounds. And then in 47, when we became independent, the government, of course, came into being, the independent government, and what it told us was, there's a new social contract, and we will lift you from poverty. Now, I'm obviously using shorthand here, but that was the essential social contract. But we were, in a sense, carrying over this paternalistic mentality. I don't think we really got over the colonial hang-up, either for the rulers or the ruled. We were hoping to be lifted out of poverty and be ruled, and were willing to be ruled. And over time then, that contract broke down. So we've seen social contracts break down well before the West has in recent memory, because people haven't been lifted out of poverty as soon as they'd want to. And then in 1991 came liberalization, and corporations, which until then, in a regulated environment, only really had to have a social contract with their employees. Frankly, even the shareholders or the consumers didn't really matter that much, neither did society. You had a license to produce something. Money was almost printed out in a limited manner. And your only obligation was to your employees, who were the people who came out and produced your widgets or whatever it was that you made. And all of a sudden, with liberalization, we were plunged into this world where we had to compete with multinationals. There was a frenzy out there. The consumer became important. But let me fast forward now and say that we have also realized, with continuing dissatisfaction amongst the public, not just with the government, but more recently even with corporations, because they now believe that corporations are corrupt, even in India. There is a concern about the big corporations, these people who came from what was known as the license Raj, the rent-seeking Raj that existed, that corporations really were caring only about making money for themselves. There's so much black money stashed away in Swiss banks, which is what the discussion, frankly, even at Davos on Indian channels is. So there is a trust deficit. So all of a sudden, we have two jobs to do. We have to cover a trust deficit with society, and we have to build a social contract with consumers, which until liberalization, we really didn't know how to do. Now, the good news is that I think India is poised, frankly, to be able to solve this problem and come out with a new model that, in fact, could be a template for the world, not just for India. And a lot of that has to do with the philosophy, frankly, that you've outlined in your article, shared values. It's been working towards it. C.K. Prahlad, the late C.K. Prahlad, talked about carving out a niche at the bottom of the pyramid. But his concept was still about building market share, building new products. Your concept, obviously, goes beyond that to say that there is a new social contract you can build while you're making money, doing good at the same time. In fact, our own company on January 17th, and I'm saying this specifically, Mike, so you won't send me an invoice for royalties. I think your article came out in January. But we've been working on this for a year with a new brand positioning. We call it Rise. And essentially what we say is from now on, the businesses we choose to do are those which will enable our customers to rise. And that could be anywhere we operate, whether it's in the US or whether it's in Germany or whether it's in India. Because everybody wants to rise and shape their own destinies. And I won't go into the details, but this is not theory. We found that we were doing it anyway. We've simply put our fingers around it. We're a company that dominates rural finance, that dominates rural agricultural mobility. We are a major player in tractors in the US, for example. So we have experienced ways in which you can do good and do well at the same time. So given this shared value, I think we have an opportunity to both address society's trust deficit and at the same time make the consumer at the center of our capability. And I think we'll do it by even leveraging new technology like social media, where bilaterally our company can make a contract with the consumer and actually differentiate itself. So there's a business model at the end of it. It's not just CSR.
How's the relationship with the employees changed as you've gone through this journey?
Well, the journey, we've been doing it. We are sort of becoming more reflective. It's something that we launched on January 17th, as I said, so it's early days. I will take no credit or blow any trumpets about that. But let me summarize the answer to your question in the words of a very senior colleague of mine who used to run our tractor business and unfortunately lost a battle to cancer just a few weeks ago. But he used to get the highest scores in 360-degree assessments. And I asked him one day, 3-4 years ago, how do you do this? Why are you so popular with everybody in the company? And he said, may I be honest? And he said, Anand, the reason is because when I come to work every day, I don't come to work for you or for the company. I come to work for the people who work for me. And that makes me a better person and I do a better job. Now, if you extend his philosophy and say, all our people, if I tell them, come to work for the people who work for you and for the customer, I think we'll have the formula.
Okay. A. You get an A. Excellent. Thank you. Stewart, you want to intervene at this point?
Just a quick one, because I think a lot of, again, really good things happening here, and I think a lot of businesses out there that are seeing that creating value that's shared with other people is also good business. But I'd like to push it just that bit further. Do we not need, at this moment in history, to actually redefine the purpose of business? I'm another business school graduate, so I learned all about discounted shareholder value and all that sort of stuff, maximizing that. But actually, isn't the purpose of business to do something that's value-driven, that creates value for society, and it needs to make profits and give a good return to investors to do so? But if we redefine the purpose, that would be a pretty dramatic step forward, and we need business leaders and others to say, it's about time we thought about that.
Well, let's carry on, and perhaps we can come back to that if we have time. And in theory, we'd love to take a question or two from the audience. I'd like to talk to some of our government leaders here. Abhisit, what should government expect from the corporation in this new social contract of this new world that we're in?
Well, you just said that could business redefine its objectives? In an ideal world, we'd love them to internalize all the externalities, pollution, social impact, and so on. But we have to live with the reality that there's going to be competition from other societies which may not share the same values, share the same objectives. So in a sense, we can expect things from the corporate world, but we cannot realistically expect them to meet that contract. We also have to send signals. We also have to create the kind of incentives so that they would respond. And I think it's possible. For instance, when Thailand was faced with the latest round of the global financial crisis, one of the things we did very early was to talk to the corporate world, and we said that our number one objective is to fight unemployment. What kind of schemes can be run that would allow you to retain your employees, retrain them if you have to, and we agree on a kind of special project where companies that decide to retain and retrain their workers get certain incentives from the government. I think that's the way we have to work. And so in that sense, I think the new contract has got to move beyond the rulers and the ruled. We're all partners now. But likewise, with citizens, another example that I can give is when I talked about having the informal sector trying to join some kind of social security system. We have no hope in trying to enforce these people to save. But we can start from localized schemes, communities, local communities. They can run their own schemes because they can enforce the savings among their own people. And we say if you run a successful savings fund within your community for 1 year, where there clearly are trends about the ability to get people to contribute and so on, we'll match your savings. But the implementation and the enforcement is actually done by the local communities. I think these are the kinds of models that we must look for. At the same time, if we can identify growth areas which are also good for society, then we can certainly push forward on those agenda. One example, and this was discussed over lunch just now, was the idea that we don't have a shortage of savings in the world, but we do have a problem about how those savings are actually used. And in fact, there are still plenty of investment opportunities, jobs creation, for instance, in the green economy. And if we, for instance, send the right signals, for instance, impose a tax on carbon, that's going to create incentives for people to look for new areas for green investment and creating green jobs.
Michelle?
Yeah, well, we've been speaking here about sharing values, but I have to say that there is a common concern too, because my friend here talked about trust deficit, and that is not only with the corporate, it's also with the politicians and with the governments. Mm-hmm. So I think governments and corporate sector have an incredible challenge, is to be able to try to build confidence. And confidence is so related in governments when you deliver and when you do what you were committed to do when you were a candidate. If your commitment, you really achieve them. And I think this is very important. But I also expect from the corporate sector, because every year when I went to the big meeting of the corporate sector, I always heard what the government had to do, what we expect from the government. And you haven't gone so fast, and we need to do it. But I never heard that's what we are going to do in order to improve productivity, competitiveness, and how we build this real partnership. We both sitting together, identify which are the key issues. And I can mention just one thing. We, before launching with a global compact, that is a group of corporate that were working with the United Nations in order to build this partnership. And tried to bring that it started like philanthropic 10 years ago, and now we're looking on transformational partnership that can produce changes. And I think we have to do that, to think what kind of new partnership we have to build in terms of, for example, a new social contract. And there is something that Helen Clark from UNPD proposed, and I think it's very important. For example, how we work together with SMEs, how corporate in different countries can include SMEs and help SMEs in their supply chain. Or how can both, in this case, United Nations, can be governments, with the corporate sector, think on developing strategies to support the SMEs, for example, with training, with managerial skills, and so on. So I think we have to think on a bigger, a best, and more strategic partnership.
Giulio, do you have any comments here?
From the European point of view, that's my experience, I see a difference between an economic cycle and a crisis. Crisis is quite diverse than an economic cycle, and it's not a garden party in bad weather conditions. It's a new paradigm. The impact of crisis on the Europe was, and is, just to be clear, the end of the old colonial era. Was very strong. Now we understand it's impossible for us to produce more public debt than growth, more deficit than GDP. And we understand the political sense of this kind of message. On the political side, we must reduce budgets, conserve and guarantee welfare state, and conserve and guarantee democracy. A lot of people, they fear globalization, they fear the unknown, they fear what is thriving. And this is the reason why in a lot of areas in Europe we see the emergence of extreme right parties and movement. And this could be the real problem we have. So on the democratic side, on the political side, we must conserve the old, the good part of the old world. On the industrial side, on the economic side, I see two targets. One is which kind of economic model. The European economic model cannot be based on internal demand, cannot be based on the export side only, can be equilibrated, adding to this kind of areas public demand, financed to, this is the reason why we are proposing Europe, a Eurobond, public demand in public investments. And this could be fundamental. On the other side, less regulation. We, in Europe, we have a lot of excessive regulation. A basic regulation is an investment, but excessive regulation is unsustainable. Why? Because now competition is not between countries, it's between continents. And it should be difficult for us to compete with continents less rigid, more flexible. I come back. Fundamental regulation is an investment, but excessive regulation is an excessive cost. And this could be the other target.
So just with a few minutes we have left, let's ask the business people here, what do you need from government? Government needs business to participate, do its role, engage in the society in a deeper way. What does business need government to do to enable it to play this role? Ron?
I think one of the critical things is predictability and stability. And I think that business can evolve as long as it can understand what the rules are. Now, we would like those rules to have whatever is an appropriate level of regulation. And while business will have its point of view, it really is the role of government to define what it believes is appropriate. But I think the uncertainty is probably one of the most important things. I think the other thing is a forward view. Government often has an ability to focus on fixing the problem we just had as opposed to the problem we're likely to have in the future. Fixing the future and worrying about the future should certainly be informed by what we've just gone through. But I'm reminded in the U.S. of the strong emphasis we placed on the Sarbanes-Oxley regulations, which certainly improved controls in corporations, but I don't think did much to avoid the type of economic challenges that we just went through.
Okay, Anand?
Mike, in India, there's an old anecdote that the IT industry arose because the government got out of the way. And then it became very popular to say, what we want is for you to get out of the way. And that's not true. And I've never been a believer of that. The last recession only proved that. And we saw America, this bastion of free market, suddenly end up owning General Motors. So there are no politicians in India who are under any illusion that of whether they're required or not. They certainly see themselves as required, and frankly, so do I. So what do we want from them? One, you want regulators. You want transparent regulations which bring the predictability and stability that Ron spoke about. Two, what I think we need are what I would call transaction templates. We're having dinner with one eminent economist last night, and he was telling me that his major concern about India was what he had been reading, that land was becoming scarce, and it's frightening that you have supply-side problems, and yet you're so congested you don't have land. And I said the problem is not geographic. It's not the scarcity of land. It's the lack of a template of how you transfer land from agriculture to industrial uses. We haven't got that right. Now, what we need is the government to step in, take help from wherever they want from the past. Chile has done a great job of this, for example. We should learn from the world and create standard templates for all these things that are needed to provide resources. If they give us that, we'll guarantee you 9% growth.
Stewart, last word?
Yeah, I think we can see by changing the nature of the corporation, a more strategic state, different responsibilities of the citizen, actually how we can both evolve the social contract and in places repair it. And I think we've had really good ideas around that. I think the problem we haven't grappled with, and it's for another day, is the contract between the current generation and future generations. Because there is a big problem which all interests don't want to deal with, including citizens, of how much we leave for the next generations and whether technology can actually solve the problems or whether we're going to run out of planet. And that one is a problem that I think, a moral problem we've got to grapple with. We don't have the means. But I think our discussion, if we can see that strategic state, that different role for business, different role for citizen, we can do something really powerful.
Well, we're out of time. I think I'm kind of struck with how much more complicated it's been to even talk about this issue in the nature of the modern world and global competition, and with the complexity that we have in the world. Governments not only have to create the conditions for prosperity in the economy, not only do they have to deal with the most disadvantaged in society, but they have to ensure a lot of social investments are made in health and wellness and some of the other areas we've talked about at the same time as resources are limited. And I think we've been struck with this balance between governments accepting responsibility for these issues, but yet getting citizens to participate in the process rather than sort of be passive and be entitled. We're seeing a similar complexity in the corporate side. I mean, it used to be pretty clear. You did your business, you kept your head down, you made your profit, you paid your taxes. That was great. That was enough. But corporations, I think, inevitably are being affected by these issues in society that are affecting them directly, and need to be playing a role in that, and kind of playing that margin, figuring out how that's going to be done is still being worked out. That said, I come away from this optimistic that thoughtful leaders in both business and government are working out a new contract. And Stewart, you're the challenger. I hope you agree.
I do agree.
Oh, good. Well, let's call this adjourned then.
With
Thank
this
you.
audience, definitely.